Well, good morning, everybody. And following on from the opening speech by Ambassador Brahimi, I'd like to begin the first panel for the conference. My name is Dr. Christian Ulrichsen. I'm a research fellow at the Baker Institute. I specifically focus my research on the political economy and international relations of the Gulf states. And this panel is on economic inclusion in the Arab Gulf. And we have 4 excellent speakers who will each give presentations of about 15 minutes. And then we'll have time for a question and answer session later on. In order of the program, I'll just briefly introduce each speaker first. Karen Young will kickstart this panel. Karen is a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C. And her research interests include Gulf states foreign policy, the political economy of transition, and identity and state formation. And she's written an excellent book on the political economy of the United Arab Emirates. We'll then have Mohammed Evren Tok. And Mohammed is a program coordinator and assistant professor in the Public Policy in Islam program for the Faculty of Islamic Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. His research involves public policy analysis, political economy and sustainability, and he's the co-lead investigator for a research project on the Qatari perspective on natural resource governance in Africa. He's written and edited a number of publications, most recently Policy Making in a Transformative State, the Case of Qatar, which employs a series of case studies to make a series of very enlightening insights into how public policy is made in Qatar itself. Then Peter Salisbury. Peter is an associate fellow at the Chatham House Middle East and North Africa program, as am I. So it's great to have a colleague. Peter was previously a journalist and an analyst, writing on political economy issues in the MENA region. And he's also now recently joined the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington as a non-resident scholar there as well. So he's also a colleague of Karen's. He's written regularly for prominent publications such as Foreign Policy. He worked on the Chatham House Yemen Forum and recently has published a lengthy but extremely valuable policy-rich report on Yemen as a chaos state and looking at some of the trajectories playing out as the Yemen war approaches its 3rd year, or the end of its 3rd year, and we see a number of scenarios in north and southern parts of Yemen and all the multiple drivers of conflict taking rather different turns. So we look forward to hearing from Peter on that. And then last but certainly not least, Al-Anud Al-Sharekh. Al-Anud is a research associate at the London Middle East Institute at SOAS, University of London, and she's based in Kuwait. Her research is on socio-political, cultural, and security issues in the Arab Gulf. She's been a consulting researcher for several academic, governmental, and non-governmental institutions, and her research focuses on the approach taken by Kuwait and the other GCC states to tackle popular discontent with economic stagnation and rising unemployment, mainly by reactivating the private sector's economic role by setting up small and medium enterprise funds and incubators to generate jobs and lessen dependency on government welfare, so extremely timely. So with that, I'd like to ask Karen to start.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, good morning. Thank you all for coming. And it's really a pleasure to be on this panel with friends and colleagues. It's a small community who works on the political economy of the Gulf, and I think especially right now, and given tensions in the region, it's really important that, that we're able to work together, and we do. So I'm going to go through, I have a number of slides. It's really too many for the 15 minutes I have, so I'm going to kind of fly through them. There is a handout somewhere if you're interested. I just sort of made a quick cheat sheet of some of the economic reforms that are underway across the GCC, because it is a lot to keep track of right now. This is a restructuring of economies, of course, a restructuring of the way we think about the social contract, of what it means to be a citizen. But some things aren't really changing. So the title of the presentation is The Political Imperative of Gulf Economic Reforms. And I say it's a political imperative because the economic imperative is in some ways sliding away as oil prices rise. So the reason why the changes that I think are necessary in these economies needs to move forward is simply because of the stress that continues to be on people, on citizens in particular, but non-citizens as well. And of course, economic inclusion is a big part of that. And what we're seeing is really the further entrenchment of the state in the state's kind of predatory nature in the economy. This is, I believe, particularly true in the Saudi case. And the number one or number two priority in jobs. We have, as was mentioned in the opening session, this isn't new. We have had high unemployment, especially among young people across the region for a long time now. But it's not budging, and it's not budging in the Gulf states for a lot of reasons, but primarily because of the entrenchment of the state and the state's belief and sense of entitlement to control large parts of the economy. This doesn't mean that you have to be a complete neoliberal and view that the restructuring is necessary just to enliven and create opportunity for the private sector. It's about human capital as well, about believing that citizens and non-citizens have the ability to create growth and to direct growth in the sectors and the areas that people define as important. And so that's what, to my mind, what matters in terms of economic inclusion, of who sets priorities and who is involved in these decision-making. So what we see is that the Gulf economies, and there is large variation, but this trend is true, the Gulf economies are still largely driven by government spending. And a lot of this spending now is debt-fueled. So governments are borrowing in order to keep these practices in place and drawing down on large reserve assets, and for different reasons. And so the structural reforms that we kind of hoped for after the decline in oil prices at the end of 2014 are in some ways moving forward in the increase in prices of electricity, of water, of fuel prices. But governments, in other ways, are offsetting that potential savings by spending in other ways. Political risk continues to be an issue because of these domestic policy upheavals, the lack of job opportunity, the poor strategic communications of governments about reforms to their citizens. And in many ways, what we're seeing is waffling or reversals on policy choices. And this is very clear in Saudi Arabia. You can't tell both the market and citizens you're going to organize the economy one day and then a week later reverse course. It becomes very, very hard then to make all kinds of choices, both for families and for businesses. And then sort of my largest critique, and I've written about this in a number of outlets, is the absence of rule-based economies. And this, I think, we see in efforts to tackle necessary reforms, as in the corruption purge in Saudi Arabia, but also kind of broader frameworks for how a lot of using other people's money, basically financial intermediation in public-private partnerships, in attracting foreign investment, in creating and protecting rights of investors. All of these things still are pretty weak across the board. All right, so now I'm going to show you a number of kind of charts and graphs, and we can reflect back on them in the Q&A. I've written about areas where these kind of parallel and supporting processes, creating a rule-based economy would be effective. And this is just kind of my laundry list of what I think is important. But when we look across the GCC economies, one thing is quite common, is that governments are still spending a lot of money on the public wage bill. So there's a preference, of course, for public sector employment, and this is a big drain on the fiscal balance. The other thing that's a big drain on the fiscal balance, and this creates also, I think, political risk for the region, is a lack of interest in reducing military spending. And I'll show you some charts to demonstrate that as well. So these are two charts from a recent IMF report. And essentially what we're looking at is some cases are more extreme than others in terms of remaining in kind of low growth and deficit kind of situations. The most kind of dire situations are in Bahrain and Oman. And these are countries where there are real issues especially in Oman, in creating jobs for young people. And the government acting as kind of the largest source of investment, the largest source of capital expenditure in the country. What you'll see changing over the next few years is that on the right side, the interest bill. So as these governments are borrowing more money, more and more of their annual budgets will also have to go towards repaying debt. So we're looking at, by 2022, as early as that, some pretty significant debt repayments. And if anyone's familiar with what happened in Latin America in the 1980s, I'm not suggesting we're going to have a complete debt crisis, but we're going to have changes, right? This will have longer-term consequences, and that's really understudied. And what it means is that governments will have less options to devote money towards healthcare, education, protection for lower-income citizens, because those resources are going to be dedicated, entrenched in military spending if things continue the way they are, and dedicated to repaying significant debt. And so in Oman especially, I think this is a big issue, but also in Bahrain. The jobs challenge is a big one, because why would you work in the private sector if the public sector pays so much more? And this is something that the IMF has been very, very clear about, even within the last week. Christine Lagarde has been making a big issue of this, and it's a simple fact, right? The development of the states in the GCC were very successful at creating healthcare systems, education systems, at creating jobs for nationals through growing institutions, through growing governments. But we're not at that stage anymore. And so the transition to whatever comes next has to deal with this issue. And it really is a challenge. The debt issuance, this is just kind of a look at where oil prices have gone and how debt has gone up. And this was mid-2017, and it's only increased and expected to increase even more in 2018. So, investors around the world are happy to buy Gulf debt. This is great for them. The interest rates are pretty low. But essentially, the long-term issue is that if you have dollar-pegged currencies, which all of the GCC states have, at some point, this will become an issue, because a lot of it is dollar-denominated debt. So it does put pressure as reserves run down on defending national currencies. Here's the more important issue. So even if you were able to hire more people into the public sector and continue spending, oil prices go up, everything's honky-dory fine, this is the issue, in that human capital and productivity, labor productivity across the GCC is pretty poor. So we're not putting people to work in ways that they are fulfilling their own intellectual and skills, abilities. We're not allowing creativity to flourish the way that it could. And this is the real loss, especially when you think about the demographics and the large youth population. Here's a group of people who are going to be incentivized for, salary reasons to work in the public sector, but to not really do much. So if you're talking about, as Ambassador Brahimi said, about building a more cohesive Arab region, having a cohesive political vision for what comes next, you're not going to get that. You're not going to achieve that by underusing human capital. So as I said, everyone's borrowing money. It's pretty easy to do. But within 5 years, this becomes a repayment issue, especially for the weaker economies like Bahrain and Oman. The entrenchment of military spending, and we know this from the literature on civil wars, that what happens when even a neighboring country is involved in a war and you have nothing to do with it, it tends to increase military spending anyway. So the Yemen war is certainly showing this to be true. Even governments that are not involved in the conflict are continuing to increase military expenditure. Oman is a case in point. But this sense of escalation and competition between GCC states in terms of military spending is also really inefficient. And how many, F-16s do you really need? It's not an efficient use of resources, and it tends to increase political tension and rivalry across the region. The sad thing is that if we would hope the private sector to sort of step in, there would be opportunity, there would be this flourishing of human capital, people doing creative and interesting new business things. Somebody has to enable that to happen, usually the bank sector, usually lending to small and medium-sized enterprises, which every development bank will tell you is a great idea. The problem is that's not what's happening, especially in Saudi Arabia. So on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, lending to the private sector has really fallen substantially in a time when government vision documents are stating explicitly this is what they want to grow. Okay, so this shows you that some message between, government taking this very, very large role in kind of mandating what kind of contracts and spending take place, and crowding out opportunity for others, is only reinforcing that public wage bill problem, that lack of opportunity problem. And the way that governments are spending money is, in the Saudi case, of course, through a drawdown in reserve assets. And the comparative in the black line is private sector credit. So all this graph is really telling you, and this is an HSBC graph, is that the private sector isn't stepping in. Right? So all of those wonderful future investment conferences of how there'll be tons of foreign direct investment coming into the region, especially to stimulate the Saudi economy, we're just not seeing it yet. What we are seeing is the government taking opportunities where past successful, whether you deem them corrupt or not, organizations are being sucked up and absorbed by the state. And we see this in construction, engineering, we see it in media companies. We're seeing it really across a range of major sectors. The region as a whole is somewhat stagnant, and the GCC here is missing an opportunity as growth is picking up in other places. So if we look at comparatively the GCC towards Central Eastern Europe and the Middle East, emerging markets as well, it's just not competing. And this is a lost opportunity, and this is where human capital isn't being really tapped into, and kind of a sad thing. On the right side, Iran, the resistance economy did work a little better, and the relief of sanctions in 2016, that nice sharp blue line that goes up is growth that happened in Iran. What does that mean? Not that everything is great in Iran, but it does mean that where there are opportunities, there are also mutual opportunities, right? So the Gulf states themselves could still play an important role in triggering growth in Iran, and that's obviously not happening. In terms of subsidy reform, it's just getting more expensive to be in the Gulf for a lot of families. This is a slide on kind of what the average Saudi family is spending now and what the government is giving in terms of the citizen account support. So basically, a lot of people applied for it. Not everybody got what they hoped, and not everybody got as much as they were expecting. So the average kind of minimum allowance is about $80 a month. For the average Saudi family, they're going to get a family of 6 with a household income of about $2,500 a month is getting about $300 in support. That's not going to cut it. And we can talk more about who gets what in what state. And I've got a handout that gives you all of the reforms across each of the 6 GCC states in terms of tax implementation. There's lots of fees, especially on foreigners, on labor costs. This is all available to you if you'd like. Another thing that governments are doing are restricting certain labor markets for nationals only. This was just announced in Oman as a 6-month experiment. This doesn't work well as either. If you're a private business, you want to hire someone, you've got a 6-month basically freeze on hiring foreigners, you just wait, right? Just wait 6 months. So basically it's creating more of a contraction in economies. This is a slide about the stimulus package. So again, just more government spending. But will these things actually enable human capital, enable growth? I think it depends how they're implemented, and it's still early to tell. This is more important. It's just not easy to be a family of 6 in Saudi Arabia in the last few years because your cost of living has been increases, and we can expect it to increase more. So the implementation of a value-added tax, reduction in subsidies on the price of fuel, water, electricity. This is an area of potential discontent. So again, we're looking very closely at young people trying to start families. These are the pressure points. And of course, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman knows this. His demographic and the group he cares most about are young people. But kind of squaring that circle in terms of policy and domestic content is going to be an ongoing challenge. So I'll kind of leave it there. You know the youth bulge statistics, that's a Saudi one. Unemployment is abysmal, especially for women. And the places where jobs are going away in Saudi Arabia are not being replaced with Saudi nationals. So lots of expats leaving, especially in construction. Of course, Saudis aren't taking those jobs, but they're also not taking manufacturing jobs. And this was the expectation, that Saudis would start working in manufacturing, but we're not seeing that match. And of women in Saudi Arabia who are looking for work, there's some problems in, no big surprise, they're paid less than men, and they're paid even less than men when they try to go to the private sector. And they're generally not trained for the jobs that are available. So again, human capital, a huge challenge. I'll stop. Thank you for letting me do all these graphs. They're available for you if you'd like to look at them afterwards. Thank you, Christian.
Mohammed.
Good morning, everybody, and special thanks to you, the organizers and the project investigators and my colleagues, actually, who made this possible. It's such an honor and opportunity to be here and to present my side of the research, actually, from Qatar here in front of such an esteemed audience. Usually I prefer making like really fancy presentations, but I was under the impression that the format will be similar to the one we had at Baker Institute last year. So more like roundtable style. So I kind of thought maybe it's better for me to just keep it like more casual. So I owe you one good presentation. So in the future, if you come to Qatar, you can ask. So the area that I focus on for the specific presentation and the paper that I have recently, at the beginning of January, I submitted to the project, in fact, is quite relevant to you, and in fact, it's an extension of what Karen actually just presented about the role of the state. And but of course, mine is looking into it more in the case of Qatar and trying to understand what the role and the impact of the state mechanism in fostering economic development, diversity, and sustainability in Qatar, with implications on the Gulf region. Let me start with a small anecdote that I had last 2 weeks ago, actually. Given that my perspective is trying to look into the role of entrepreneurship as an economic endeavor that is highly supported by the Qatari state, I'm trying to interrogate why it hasn't actually proven to be successful, and what are some of the advantages, or let's say areas that it provides dynamism, and some other areas it failed to kind of produce desired outcomes. in a meeting actually organized by the Minister of Economy of Qatar a few weeks ago, and we have attended as the faculty, as I am also acting as the Dean of Innovation, and the whole idea was to promote and cultivate more partnerships with the Minister of Economy and the university, which is quite understandable. But on a separate front, when we were asked to present what kind of research we do, and the first thing I talked about was my research grant actually on entrepreneurship education in Qatar and how to localize it. And the response of one of the higher levels of the ministry, representatives of ministry, was actually that Qatar Development Bank, which is pretty much the most central organization in this graph. This is the Qatar's entrepreneurship ecosystem, and I don't want to go into the details, and I don't expect you to read every single thing. I know it's very like low resolution and there's multiple actors, but this shows how convoluted and how crowded and populated the Qatar's entrepreneurship ecosystem. Certain actually companies, corporations, government, research institutes, the financial part, the media part, education part. So it is such a vibrant environment and ecosystem in Qatar. So in this environment, working on entrepreneurship education is of course not a big surprise, but the response of the official was that Qatar Development Bank, by creating all this like ecosystem of entrepreneurship and its education, is pretty much wasting money. So this was quite, of course, surprising to me, because there is in Qatar almost every week one organization is doing either a boot camp or acceleration program or similar activity or hackathon, so to promote and foster entrepreneurship. And of course, this specific visual is coming from Silatech, which is a member of Qatar Foundation, where I belong. And this is an organization which promotes small and medium enterprise development in the Middle East and North Africa. So it is not just a pure Qatari organization that we are talking about with a lot of externalities. So the question, in fact, the response of the official from the Minister of Economy was, to me, it was like a brain teaser, because it made me think more about the question of the role of government in a market-oriented economy. So on the one hand, we see this convoluted, crowded, populated entrepreneurship ecosystem, which I believe is the problem and the solution, because it's the state that's cultivating this ecosystem, but again, it's the state which is not helping this ecosystem to turn into a more productive mechanism. So on the one hand, yes, there is a lot of state support into entrepreneurs in Qatar, and also not only in Qatar, in the region, but at the same time, if you look at the role of small and medium enterprise and micro enterprise in Qatar, it's still less than 13% in terms of their contribution to the GDP. So overall, the argument of my paper was that Qatari experience tells us a lot about state-led entrepreneurship, and this has both the positive and negative sides. And the involvement of the state and its lead in building entrepreneurial ecosystems do not necessarily create success stories. On a positive side, as a result of this ecosystem which has been cultivated in the past decade, I presume, if you look at Qatar, for instance, as in the index of Global Entrepreneurship Index, Qatar ranks 24. On the other hand, United Arab Emirates rank 19th, and Saudi Arabia 36, which is actually, it's in a certain way, it's a success. But if you look at, for instance, Global Competitiveness Report of 2016 and 17, Qatar ranked so low, and especially in areas of innovation and business sophistication, Qatar ranks around 100. In terms of doing business index, again, Qatar ranks 83 in the world. So I'm just trying to juxtapose certain areas that this ecosystem created as a positive outcome, and certain other areas, the same ecosystem didn't really help Qatar to flourish. For instance, to give you a bit more details, in terms of starting a business, Qatar ranks 91 in the world. In terms of registering property, 26, getting credit, 139, trading across borders, 128, protecting minority investors, 183. It's protecting minority investors, which means that the foreign capitalist who wants to come and invest in Qatar is not really protected. This takes me to an important realm and argumentation, which is the nature of state involvement. So here we come across a dual perspective, in the sense that the involvement of the state or the conceptualization of the state is both strong and weak. the state is strong because as an instigator, as creator of this ecosystem which requires a lot of investment and dynamism, as an instigator, as a doer, as an initiator, it's strong. But it's weak in terms of creating an enabling environment for private sector development which is independent of the state. I can give you some few examples to illustrate this point. For instance, recently, one subsidiary of Qatar Development Bank is Qatar Business Incubation Center, and every year they have 3 waves, and in their waves they incubate different local and also regional companies. And if you look at what they do, it's quite surprising, because just an example of a company called Wahab, for instance. Wahab is a company which rents government equipment and which actually uses most of the paper and cartons that's coming from the government entities, and also garbage coming out of mostly the private sector, and doing composting and creating fertilizers. So it's just simply the private sector is coming in between, where the whole value chain is starting with the government and ending with the government. So this is just an example. Or if you look at the paper industry, again, you will see that there is a lot of paper coming from the government and cartons, and it's in the past, for instance, if you look at before the blockade, Qatar has been importing most of its paper and cartons and boxes, for instance, from Saudi Arabia, which is now closed, and the only opportunity for the local system, the local capacity to respond to the market demand is only 16%. So there are solutions that are coming from homegrown initiatives, but apparently post-blockade situation is not really helping Qatar in certain different ways. Another area that's interesting is some niche markets. For instance, a company, again, incubated in Qatar called Realis, is importing certain innovative material from Finland and turning paper into furniture. So again, these niche markets have become so popular, and the people's understandings of entrepreneurship, because it's so state-driven and because they know that it's at some stage it will be captured by the state, again, they try to kind of like almost half of my students, for instance, rather than coming to the university and taking courses, they have actually cupcake Instagram accounts, and they're trying to sell. So it's this is the perception and attitude towards entrepreneurship, which needs to change. And the state, by cultivating this ecosystem, has made the first step, but is not allowing the next stages to kind of really unfold. So one interesting actually area that I want to make is about again the post-blockade, because when I started doing my paper, it's 3 minutes, unbelievable. So the single window of opportunity. Right after the blockade in June 2017, the state of Qatar introduced single window of opportunity. And according to this, the investors and entrepreneurs, they've been actually, all of the requirements of doing business, bureaucracy, paperwork, getting funding, logistics, finance, every single thing have been all merged into one single website. And this has created, of course, in the first 3 to 5 months, it created a lot of dynamism. And even their website actually collapsed because of this. My interviews in the later stages, especially in the past month or so, have been illustrating that the wave is now going back. Yes, there was a wave of Qataris becoming more patriotic and try to become more entrepreneurs and contribute to the country, but the old habit of buying property and just getting the real estate sector is now getting back on, actually, and this is one of the fears of Qataris. And it's also interesting that in social media it's not surprising that you see some prominent Qatari entrepreneurs, male and female, are publicizing about their work, and they're offering free help to other Qataris to set up their own business. So it's the repercussions of the blockade has been creating this patriotic communitarian responses as well. But again, this richness, this rich environment, because it's community-based, I believe it's quite rich, but it's not really supported by the government. So my last point is that one of the illustrations we did for the ARC, Annual Research Conference of Qatar Foundation last year, was to categorize Qatar's development. And so we identified between the decade of 2000 and between 2000 and 2010 was the decade of oil and gas era for Qatar. And in this decade, the average GDP growth was 13%. And the next decade, 2010 to 2020, is the decade of infrastructure and getting prepared for the World Cup and the metro and all the infrastructure like initiatives in Qatar has been actually drawing resources. And the annual GDP growth, part of it, of course, is forecast is 6%, probably a bit slightly lower. But the next decade, 2020 to 2030, is called Sustainable Diversification Era. So what the blockade has done to Qatar is it pretty much brought the new era a bit earlier. So now Qatar is not just only working on infrastructure, but also working towards sustainable diversification, which is in a premature way. But this also has some, I believe, positive implications for the region, because now Qatari effort and the large financial resources, they have to utilize and harness them in a more clever way that better promotes and supports the region, and which create more dynamism back in Qatar, I believe, through market mechanism.
Thank you.
Can I do something really quickly? Sorry, I don't have an amazing... Oh, I don't have access to the... Or do I? So there isn't a PowerPoint presentation. What I'm going to do, if it's all possible, is something very low-tech, which is go on the internet while you're all watching, and try and load up our fabulous map. Give me a second. Yeah. This is what you all came from, to see someone playing around on the internet. Let's see if this works. All right. It even works on Lebanese internet. Fantastic. All right. My colleagues have come with wonderful organograms and PowerPoints. And with really brilliant political science backgrounds. Although I dabble in the political science side of things, my background is as a journalist, and I try and tell things often through stories, so I'm going to try and do a little bit of that today. I was really excited to be asked to join this project, as I thought it was an opportunity to step away from my usual work on Yemen, but unfortunately what I've ended up is making it all about Yemen. So for this I apologize. I'll start with a little bit of an anecdote and move on from there. So in early 2012, I was working as a journalist. I was writing some stuff for The Economist, and I was traveling through the Tama region of Yemen, which is along the country's west coast, and I was writing about poverty. I was writing about the economic crisis that had been long bubbling, but had been exacerbated by the Arab Spring uprisings of 2011, the unrest in the country. And the Tihama is one of the poorest parts of Yemen. When you hear about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen right now, about malnutrition, about diphtheria, etc., etc., this is the area of the country, and I can point it out here. It's along here on the west coast. It's the area that's most badly affected. Really big population, very, very rural, not much in the way of water resource, and now not much in the way of an economy. And I met, while I was traveling there, some extremely malnourished children, some people in really dire straits. Until one day during this trip, we turned down a little road and we come to a village where the kids are, I'd say on average, 1 to 2 inches taller than children elsewhere in the country. They're pretty happy, they're pretty healthy. And there's a wonderful, just down maybe sort of 20 meters down from the village, there is a wonderful water pumping system, which is nice and shiny and has a regular supply of fuel. So I start asking around in this village, what's going on here? I'm in the poorest part of Yemen. What is it about the economy of this one small village that makes a difference compared to the rest of the country? And the answer was that one of the residents of the village, some 25 years before, had moved to Saudi Arabia and become the driver for a wealthy businessman in Jeddah, who had his own NGO. And this NGO had been providing for the better part of 10 to 15 years a regular supply of diesel. It had built the pump, and it provided some funding for local education initiatives, including a small school. So there was this island of relative wealth, relative development in this one small village, and it came from a businessman in Jeddah with his own little NGO, which in effect was really built to fund projects in the hometowns of his workers, of the people who work for him, I think not just in Yemen, also in Pakistan. And what's been really great about this project is it's really given me an opportunity to go back and think a lot harder about why that is and the significance of initiatives like these, about the approach in the Gulf states to aid the world over. Now, this isn't something that's unique to the Gulf states. This isn't something that's particularly rare. But what we do have is a very different approach in the GCC to aid than we might have in OECD countries. And what's particularly interesting about that is that although the OECD countries who sort of measure their ODA, their overseas development assistance, believe themselves to be among the biggest givers in terms of aid, the biggest donors internationally. In fact, one of the people that I interviewed for the paper describes the Gulf states as quiet giants in the world of aid. Saudi Arabia in the 1970s and 1980s, according to figures provided internally within Saudi Arabia, claimed to be the biggest donor per capita and by percentage of GDP in the world. Kuwait has a long history, and it's part of the culture of Kuwait, it's part of the identity of Kuwait, that it is a charitable country, that it gives aid. But when we think about questions of development initiatives, when we think about the UNDP approach to development across the developing quote-unquote world and in some of the world's poorest countries, we don't think of the GCC states. And the reason for this, I found as I got into this report, really, into this research, was and is that the approach has been much more individualistic and much more based on personalized relationship, even at the level of state NGOs, even, well, not state NGOs, of state-led development agencies. One of the first issues that I had coming into this report, where the question that I was really asking was to ask a series of questions about how and why the Gulf states have used and given foreign aid, what lessons have been learned in the use of this foreign aid abroad, and whether or not any of these questions, these lessons learned, have been applied at home, and whether, given the rapid development of the Gulf states over the last 30, 40 years, those lessons learned at home have been applied abroad. I went into the paper asking all of these questions, and one of the first problems that I had really was the lack of documentation, the lack of a theory of development within the key state-led agencies within the GCC countries, either in Arabic or English. So we have a lot of money that's being given, but one, there has been a history of a lack of financial tracking of this aid, and two, there has been a lack of a binding theory of what this aid is and what it's for and how it's used, which is very interesting in and of itself. And the next thing that sort of really came out of this work is this very sort of traditional conceptualization of aid. This idea that aid is given, that money is given as a form of charity, as something which is a responsibility incumbent on individuals and incumbent on a society, but that there is, again, no binding theory of how that's given. So it's very much sort of a traditional thinking historically in terms of someone is in need and I give. And one of the useful things, though, is being able to use Yemen, a country which I'm very well acquainted with, as a case study in all of this. So being able to go and look at some of the projects that have been done in Yemen. And when we come back to this question of the water well, that's not an isolated incident. I can go to villages and towns in Yemen where there are schools that have been provided by Saudi Arabia, by Kuwait, latterly by Qatar, where there are projects that have been developed by the UAE. And some of these are still wonderfully well funded, and in some cases you have wonderful structures, really beautiful schools that have been built, which have been absolutely abandoned. And what that comes down to in many cases is that this is a project which has been developed by an individual, be they the head of an NGO, be they someone within a state-led development agency, where they've taken interest first in Yemen, and often they've located the area where that project is going to be developed on the basis of personal relations on the basis of knowing someone who knows someone who knows someone, whereas the approach at that OECD, at that UN level for the past 20, 30 years has been much more about thinking about things in very macro terms, about doing very in-depth granular studies about where is need, what are the developmental needs, and how do we create this idea of capacity building, which is something that has been quite alien until the last 10, 15 years in the Gulf aid sector. Now, the reason that all of these questions are important and why we're sort of bundling them all together in this project is that Western nations, OECD countries, are struggling more and more to justify the money that they're giving abroad, the 0.1, the 0.2% of GDP. The UN is increasingly, in an age of many, many humanitarian crises, developmental crises, struggling to be able to fundraise. And increasingly, particularly within the Middle East and North Africa, what we're seeing is people appearing cap in hand in the Gulf, moving across the GCC and asking people to fund lots of different projects, particularly in countries like Yemen. So after the Arab Spring uprisings of 2011, after Yemen's own experience with the Arab Spring uprisings, there was a huge economic crisis in the country, and that was for a variety of different reasons. Yemen has a lot of very long-term structural issues within its economy, lots of long-term developmental issues, but there was this sense, there was this need for a large infusion of cash into Yemen. Now, when Yemeni experts in development in the humanitarian sector looked at the issue, looked at the need, what they suggested was a series of very small local level projects which would cost $100, $150 million a year, let's say, just to give an example. But what you saw was the UN, various Western states moving towards the GCC states and asking for a large infusion of cash into the country, and the development of a series of mega projects. So we're going to redevelop the ports, we're going to build power stations, we're going to rebuild airports here and there. And at the same time, we saw a lack of coordination between GCC NGOs, of which there had been a large number, and which the number increased after 2011, operating out of Sana'a, but not cooperating with other NGOs, not working with the INGO forum in the country, not working with the UN, and actually, in many cases, circumventing the Ministry of Planning in Yemen, and continuing to take this very individualistic approach on the ground. So you've got these big macro projects that look great in newspapers, and then you've got these very small granular projects which no one can track and no one can really say what their effectiveness is and what they're doing. And the question that I ended up asking during that period when I was looking at these things was, well, what's the purpose of these projects? And over the last 10, 15 years, again within sort of the OECD countries, people have been thinking a lot more about the soft power that aid buys them. They've been thinking about what their image is, but they've also been thinking about what they gain politically. So obviously after 2001, within the US, there were a lot of conversations about this idea of a whole of government approach to aid development and counterterrorism. So we go to a country like Yemen, and the reason that we're giving aid is because we're going to give people jobs, which stops them, in a very simplistic narrative, from joining jihadi groups, from becoming terrorists and attacking the United States of America. But again, within Yemen, within the GCC states, what you saw was this approach of one and the same time looking to be able to sell these big projects in a way that they would at home by making massive announcements of MOUs, of memorandums of understandings for huge projects, and at one and the same time continuing very, very quietly to operate at a local level. So soft power was being earned at the local level, and there was an attempt to buy it at the national level. And throughout that period, the issue for Yemen itself became one of implementation, became the conditionality and the strings that were being attached to that aid, and the way that the GCC states were approaching these things. Now, I'm going to have to skip through because, like everybody else, I've tried to sort of pack far too much in. I'll spare you an overview of development in Yemen from the 70s through to 2011. But what's been interesting in Yemen since the civil war began in 2014, 2015, is how this has played out on the ground, this very individualized approach to development. Now, as Christian said, at Chatham House, we've just released this very long paper describing Yemen as what I call a chaos state, and we've also produced this map here, which I won't go through right now, but it's completely interactive, so you can go on the internet, you can play around with it. And what the map does is it breaks down the different areas of control within the country. And what the paper does is make this argument that rather than this being a civil war, very clearly delineated, very linear between two sides, in which the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, are on one side, and the Houthi-Saleh alliance, as was, now the Houthis alone, as backed by Iran, sit on the other side. There's much more complexity on the ground. And this is where this very individualistic, this very personalized approach to aid and development and to giving becomes much, much more complex. Because what we've seen is that since the war began, you've really ended up outside of Houthi-Saleh-controlled territory, two major spheres of influence. The first is here, which runs from Marib and Al-Jarf through northern Hadramaut here. And in these areas, what you've got are military units, tribal militias, and other militias with links to Islah, Yemen's main Sunni Islamist party, sometimes inaccurately described as Yemen's Muslim Brotherhood, backed mainly by Saudi Arabia through certain key figures from within Islah. And in the south, what we've got is this area that I call the Tribal South, then southern Hadramaut, and into Aden, you've got a number of different militias that have been constructed from the ground up in many cases, largely by the United Arab Emirates, who are secessionists in character. Now, over the past 4 days, what we've seen is a lot of fighting in Aden for control of the city, not between the Houthis and other groups, but between Saudi-backed government on the one hand and these UAE-backed militias on the other hand. And what we've also seen since the beginning of the conflict is different approaches in development on the ground. So we've seen the UAE Red Crescent working largely across the south of the country. We've seen the UAE government giving support and developing capacity in the south, while Saudi Arabia has been operating up here in the north. And again, when you speak to the UN, when you speak to sort of organizations like INGO Forum, no coordination at that top level, international level. And what this translates into, really, one can argue, particularly in the case of Yemen, but there are other examples to be given here in Libya, in Syria, and elsewhere, is that this very individualized approach actually really lends itself to continued state fragmentations in countries that are what we call chaos states, countries where the state exists only really as a concept on a piece of paper and a boundary drawn on a map. But the reality inside is one of multiple overlapping but not combined, structured without a central state structure. And this really is going to be a complex and difficult issue as the international community, quote unquote, looks to the GCC states to become an ever more important funder, but at one and the same time, the GCC states start thinking more and more about what they get, the political gains that they're going to be making from the aid that they're giving, and as in Yemen, where we see money and aid being funneled into particular projects and humanitarian development plans in order to help them achieve their particular agendas on the ground. Done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Can I get the clicker from you, please, Karen? Thanks. I have a presentation. Okay. I want to first thank my colleagues for their really interesting papers, and I think this frames my paper in a very let's say, different direction than Peter's, because Kuwait doesn't have a problem with resources. We have a lot of resources, but we do have a problem using those resources to kickstart our economy, specifically where it comes to economic reform. So what I've done in this paper is try to look at the National Fund for SME Development as a vehicle for economic reform in Kuwait and what that means for other countries in the Arabian Gulf. Now, we have to frame the relaunching of the National SME Fund within the Arab Spring protests. Kuwait was an exception, I think, because the state is an oil-rich welfare state. The problems weren't sectarian like they were made to seem in Bahrain. And the numbers of protesters that took to the street was alarming for our leadership. So the range, depending on who reported it, was anywhere between 20,000 to 50,000 protesters on the streets, which is a big number for Kuwaiti nationals. And these were nationals who were mainstream Kuwaitis. They were Sunnis, they were mostly tribal. So this really caused our leadership to take a step back. Why weren't they immune? So the period from 2010 to 2012, it witnessed a lot of mass upheavals, and it even led to the resignation of the prime minister due to accusations of corruption, but because of popular pressure. And this is a GCC first, that a ruling family member leaves a really important position because of popular pressure. So the protests, they were fueled by politicians. The rhetoric was very confrontational, and mainly by these young people who were really frustrated by the existing system, and the government really scrambled to try and find a solution to this, because the youth were becoming increasingly more vocal, sometimes more violent, some destruction of property happened, and their demands were very clearly articulated. They wanted greater inclusion, they wanted more transparency, and they wanted immediate reform. So what happened here is that the government was not willing to concede some of the political changes that they were asking for. So, for example, the idea of an elected prime minister, which was one of the demands, is not something that the government was willing to consider. But what the government was willing to try and move towards are some economic reforms that may placate the younger generation. So, the entrenchment of this endemic corruption is something that has been building up. So even though there was a lot of movement to try and contain the youth, to try and maneuver between the political movements that were happening in Kuwait, the idea of this really entrenched system of corruption and not being able to control aspects of government spending is really fueling this kind of trust crisis that happened then in Kuwait and is continuing to today. So this is an example of a statement that was issued by a civil society organization called the Kuwait Economic Society, and they're asking for an account for the 3.8 billion KD, which is about $14 billion that has been missing from governmental spending accounts. So in Kuwait, we have transparency of another kind. We have the figures, we just don't know what happened to the money. So part of the movement to try and introduce economic reforms that would move the issue forward was the 2016 Economic Reform Bill. And this was the way for the government to find a solution to economic stagnation and youth frustration. Despite the really rise in oil prices that the region had witnessed, Kuwait hadn't found a way to translate that really into moving the economy as much as young people wanted. And this was a really ambitious reform bill that the government presented. And Goal 3, which I've highlighted here, really focused on the role of SMEs. So Goal 3 would lead to more privatization of government services, further inclusion of the private sector, and really to support SMEs through government financing. This would include anti-monopoly regulations and creating a more business-friendly environment, and this very ambitious last goal, 2,727 new SME projects that would create 3,500 new jobs for nationals within 4 years. So this is a graph from this economic reform bill, and I just wanted to highlight a number here. So 470 million Kuwaiti dinars, which is about 1.5 billion US dollars, was meant to fund these SME projects. So when we look at the SME climate in Kuwait, we realize that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So not just the huge injection of government money into it, because it's much lower than let's say the emerging and developing market average, but also that it doesn't employ enough of the Kuwaiti workforce. And this has become a really important part of the Kuwaiti reform plan. How do we get more nationals into the private sector? How do we resolve the kind of structural unemployment that we have in the public sector? So the National Fund for SME Development was seen as this vehicle to help move this process along. This is not the first time that Kuwait, as a government, has funded an SME incubator or an SME fund, but this was seen as kind of a new approach to it. So the National Fund of SME Development is seen as an extension of the Small Projects Development Company, which existed for 14 years before, and which had a capital of 100 million KD, which is about 400 million US dollars. The problem with this company was that it wasn't considered a great success because of the types of projects. I know Mohammed spoke about cupcake stores and t-shirt stores, but we had a lot of them as well in the Small Projects Development Company. There wasn't enough monitoring and evaluation for where the money went. There wasn't enough of an incentive on the young investors to really repay the government for this initial investment, seed money. So the newly launched Kuwait National Development Fund, which was announced and launched in 2013, though it didn't start its activities until a while later, it had a much bigger capital base, and it was supposed to be much more streamlined in its approach. So the purpose was to diversify the economy through supporting small and medium enterprises, but also to create more jobs for Kuwaiti nationals. So you can see that this is a mantra that underlines this. So this was supposed to be tackled through 4 fronts, right? The National Fund for SME Development would focus on removing structural and logistical obstacles to SME growth, while also tackling the laws and the hearts and minds of stakeholders. And this, the goal number 4, is considered the most difficult, even by members of the board, because there's such a deeply entrenched attitude, first, that you would have to wean Kuwaitis off their dependence on government jobs, but also you would have to change the stakeholders within Kuwaiti's private sector to create more space for new and young players. The eligibility for the applicants for the National Fund for SMEs was considered to be an inclusive approach. The idea was that this vehicle wouldn't just be accessible to those who came from a certain socioeconomic background, which is often the accusation that is leveled against the private sector players in Kuwait, and that it would be open to a wider spectrum of Kuwaitis. So the idea was to make it a smaller cap, so only companies that wouldn't exceed 500,000 Kuwaiti dinars in funding, and that they would have to commit to having Kuwaiti nationals work, and that they could also come up with 20% of the financing. The idea was to not repeat the problems that happened in the small business development company, was to have some skin in the game for the young investors. Now, what happened in actuality was that it only started to grant the loans in 2016. So the 3 years that it took for the fund to be ready to grant loans were spent doing a lot of the internal structuring, a lot of the restructuring of laws, and the fact that by January 2017 there were only 141 projects funded. This shows that it was considerably less than the 508 that were imagined by the reform bill. This delay caused a lot of resentment. A lot of people attacked what they considered the inflated pay for the board and the board's focus on media appearances to drum up support and interest in the fund before it was ready to commence its loaning activities. So the board insisted that it took this long to iron out a lot of the issues internally, and the end result was that these are the main successes. Thank you. A one-stop system within the Ministry of Commerce, and that they changed legislations to allow government employees to take a leave of absence to try to encourage more people to leave the public sector, and an online application form and call center for inquiries. The challenges that were reported were that the staff running the National Fund for SME Development weren't experienced enough, they were unable to handle demand, there's a multi-ministry requirement, and there's a breakdown in the chain of communication, sometimes between the fund and the applicants. And then there's the business atmosphere itself. There's a lack of a competitive workforce, and a lot of the business ideas, they lack scalability and growth. So their success is tied into a local perspective. And this is an example of the kind of articles that were written to describe the disappointment felt by the National SME Fund. Now, the government is clearly aware of the issue, and what they've tried to do to tackle it is have a lot of town hall meetings between government figures and the youth in Kuwait. This is an example of one in a working space downtown Kuwait, where he tries to explain, the Minister of Commerce and Industry tries to explain the government's role in SMEs. There's also a temporary committee to improve the business ecosystem with 4 young parliamentarians in Parliament that are trying to work on it, and open forums. They're trying to change nonprofit laws to try to remedy the situation. But again, there's this a kind of over-promising, which might lead to under-delivering, where the minister commits to finding a resolution with the World Bank, who are their advisors, within a very short space of time. So these are the type of impediments. This is the ranking that Kuwait wants to change in terms of ease of doing business. It's currently at 102, and it hopes to change all of this in order to become a more competitive environment to encourage SMEs. But I think what's more important for us to consider is that, is there a genuine commitment to economic reform? So when we look at the Gulf states, this question has to be at the back of our heads. A country like Kuwait has produced some incredible success stories in the past few years, from startups that became SMEs and then became power players. So companies like Boutiquat, which just sold a big stake for $80 million US, Carriage, Talabat, which was sold to a German company, Rocket Internet, for $170 million US. We have Ashaya, our retail giant, Zain, a blue chip communications company, NBK in banking. So why is it not succeeding in invigorating SMEs? What is really the problem here? And these are some of the questions that came up during a number of the interviews that I conducted. So is subsidizing the private sector really a solution? Should the focus be more on reforming public sector as the fiscal policy driver? And the other one, which I will conclude with, is there are conflicts of interests at work here. So if $2 trillion in private wealth runs the private sector, and this is owned by mostly family-run companies who are also part of the power structure, who are also part of the government, who are also leading the economic reform, which may not be a good thing for their businesses, right? How do we start to unravel this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You actually brought back the discussion full circle to what Karen called the political imperative of economic reform. And on the way, we had some excellent case studies from the ground up of some of the challenges and opportunities as well of recent developments. So we have about 20 minutes for discussion, for Q&A. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. There's a microphone over there. And please introduce yourself. And if there's a specific person you'd like to direct your question to, please also say that. So who'd like to start the discussion? Rami.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. I'd like to ask Al-Anud, the Kuwait situation has always, in the last 20 years, struck me as really one of the most significant in the Arab world, with a small, relatively homogeneous population, quite well off, but politically effervescent. Every once in a while things happen, and in recent years, much more effervescent, as you said. Has there been any ever attempt in Kuwait to address the political participation issue, to make the inclusion, which is part of the name of this conference, and you mentioned it as one of the youth's demands, to actually have inclusion that has proper accountability beyond what you have now, which is people get angry, the people demonstrate, the Emir closes the parliament, and they try it again every 2 or 3 years. Is there any discussion of real political reform, not total change, but at least serious reform?
Thank you for this interesting but difficult question. I can't be a spokesperson for the entirety of Kuwait's government and its civil society sector, but from what I'm seeing, I think that there has been some interesting movements towards the definition of inclusion. As you know, Kuwait, like many of the GCC states, nationals are actually much less than non-nationals. So will the conversation of inclusion include the many non-nationals that are living in GCC states? I think this is also another issue that is coming up specifically when it comes to political inclusion, because so far they haven't been included. And this is also one of the things that came up in the SME structure in Kuwait, that it specifically does not include non-nationals. So this is a shame, because there's a lot of talent and potential there that is possibly going to waste. I don't see immediate political reforms in terms of changing the status quo happening. The appetite for change has dampened a great deal, even among young people, because of what happened after the Arab Spring in other countries, and also because right now it seems that peninsula is boiling. There are 2 failed states in the north, a failed state in the south, and a Gulf crisis amongst friends and neighbors. So right now, I think the demands for greater political transformation have been put on hold, because everybody is trying to work out what the security issues facing us are.
Issam.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. My name is Munir Mahmalat. I'm a fellow at the Harvard Department of Government. I have a question to you as well. Now, you were talking about all these interesting economic reforms, and at the very end were telling us a little bit about the resentments and possible entrenchments, specifically of the government family. At the same time, these reforms have been, at least on paper, widely implemented, which implies that there are enough groups in the country that actually advocated for them. And I would like to ask you a little bit, to talk a little bit more about who was actually advocating for them, and how were they campaigning for them. So tell us a little bit more about the battle of interest groups in the country, and that are, at least to some extent, strong enough to battle the government and this entrenched interest to a certain extent. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I'll just give you an example of conflicting interest groups, and it's not just the government. So, for example, the Speaker of the House for our National Assembly is Marzouk Al-Ghanem. His father is the head of the Chamber of Commerce. So when you're trying to push through legislations that will lead to a lessening of monopolies, greater economic reform, more inclusion, are you coming up against the interests of the entrenched merchant elites, or are you not? So this is, one example of conflicting interests. Another thing that you asked about was who is advocating for change. So I showed a statement that was issued by the Kuwait Economic Society. We have a very vibrant civil society in Kuwait, a very politicized NGO sector, even though that's technically illegal. And we have highly educated but extremely frustrated young people. If we look at the demographics in Kuwait, more than 60% of the national population is under 25. If we take youth up to 45 and under, we find it's about 82% of the population is 45 and under. All these people have been promised a certain nanny state dream. They have a sense of entitlement, and they want to be included in the process. So they're demanding a lot of these economic reforms. There's popular pressure on the government and on our representatives in National Assembly to introduce these reforms. They're being met by structural, logistical, and entrenched interests by political and merchant elites. And also, I think just by the lack of, let's say, exposure that our highly educated young people have. They may be educated, but they're not exposed. So these are the types of different intersectionalities that we're seeing happening today.
Rana Harbi, Al-Akhbar newspaper, a Beirut-based Al-Akhbar newspaper. My work is focused basically on Yemen and arms trade. So of course my question is for Peter. While you were speaking, I was writing so many notes down, but at the end, the last sentence basically summed it up, that it's politically motivated some way or another. And I wasn't sure about the time frame that you were referring to, because like ignoring the fact that GCC countries are basically bombing Yemen, as in bombing the infrastructure, etc., which is something that's not, that I'm not saying, but academics are saying that there's a systematical targeting of Yemen's infrastructure and so on. So how can you explain how they're still involved in the bombing for 3 years, specifically next month there will be 3 years, while at the same time promising $1.5 billion in aid a couple of days ago and $2 billion into the banks and whatnot. So how can we explain this? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, this isn't a unique situation at all, where an external power enters into a conflict in another country and at one and the same time is a combatant, but also sort of a primary sort of provider of aid. Example, obviously, the US in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the ambassador can speak to those issues much better than I can. What's been very interesting is, I'm not saying that all aid has been given on a politicized basis historically, but what I am saying is the way that aid has been given, the mechanisms for distribution have historically been quite personalized. And now we have a situation, a context in Yemen, in Libya, in Syria and other places, where there's a really high structure of incentives to ensure that aid is delivered to certain groups, certain individuals, certain areas geographically, at the same time that the international community is looking to the GCC states, Saudi Arabia in particular, the UAE in particular, to provide aid. And they're able to create conditionality on that aid, which allows them to fulfill a certain agenda. So Saudi Arabia has just announced its own humanitarian plan for Yemen. The UN had to rush the announcement of its humanitarian plan for Yemen because the Saudis were going to announce theirs the day before the UN one. So they then there was a race to announce the different plans. And a skeptic might say that the Saudi plan is very much focused on ensuring control of key logistical hubs in quote-unquote government-controlled areas, and ensuring that aid flows into and through areas controlled by and governed, quote unquote governed, there's not a lot of governance going on in Yemen right now, by their allies on the ground, but not selling this and presenting this as a redirection of aid away from the northwest of the country, which is also where 80% of the population lives, working on the basis that as long as aid is flowing into these areas, that can be sold as sort of a humanitarian plan, whereas obviously there is sort of an instinctive political element to that. So yes, it's deeply problematic, but at one and the same time, no one else is giving that money. And this is the really big problem for Yemen in particular. Once Saudi Arabia has promised $1.5 billion in aid to a country like Yemen, that has a chilling effect on other donors. Why would the US, the UK, Norway give money when the humanitarian plan is largely funded already? And that creates sort of even more power in their ability to define the way that things are provided. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I'm Mazen Hassan from Cairo University. My questions are for Mohammed and Al-Anoud. These initiatives to encourage entrepreneurship and SMEs in Qatar and Kuwait, how far do you see them as satisfying political objectives rather than economic objectives? I mean, many Arab macroeconomists would say that these initiatives will not solve youth unemployment problems in the Arab world. The main problem of SMEs are not really getting funding. So how far is it that the government is actually wants to be seen as if it is tackling the problem, youth unemployment, youth bulge, etc., rather than actually solving it?
You want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. In the case of Qatar, I believe the answer to this question is pretty much explained in the and illustrated in the National Vision, Qatar National Vision 2030, the way they envision the long-term future. And one interesting thing actually is that yes, Qatar put a lot of passions in terms of creating a knowledge-based economy in their national vision, and SMEs and other actually non-hydrocarbon side of the economy is very important to establish this objective for sure. But if you look at the national development strategies of 2011-2016 and 17 to 2022, you will see that there is now less passion in terms of building SMEs. I mean, in the past, if you look at the 2011-16 development strategy, there was a very keen, there was like almost excessive focus and emphasis on creating a vibrant SME sector. But in the new report, in the new development strategy, 5-year strategy, then it's kind of like a bit retreat from the first aspiration. So I believe there is, of course, as Al-Anoud mentioned, there is the conflict of interest issue. Same in Qatar, you'll see that there's many families in the government, different positions, not necessarily at higher, but even lower positions. They're also involved in private sector development or in other committees, so on and so forth. So there is a conflict of interest issue. But I believe the crisis, the Gulf crisis now that Qatar is in the middle of it, at the epicenter of it, is an opportunity to realize that there has to be more reception to foreign capitalists to come and invest in Qatar. So, and one of the intentions that I couldn't explain much, but the single window of opportunity is some part of it is about promoting Qataris to create partnerships with foreign capitalists and to come and build actually in Qatar more in the realm of production rather than just like real estate or like let's say non-productive capitalists. So it's an opportunity, but of course there is a conflict of interest problem, and on top of it there is a regulatory and legal problem that's still not there in Qatar. So which will take time. So.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I don't think the issue per se is with state intervention in the SME sector. I mean, this is not unique to the Gulf. It's happened in other countries, and it leads to creating a window for research and development, and letting people focus on novel ideas that could flourish. What has emerged in Kuwait as an issue is that the products of our education system aren't meeting the demands of the private sector and for an innovative SME sector. So I think the need to tackle that issue is going to be a much more difficult conversation moving forward than the fact that having these vehicles there to assist young people or people who are in the public sector to move to the private sector. That is only a good thing. It's the deeply entrenched structural problems that we have, the quality of our education, the quality of our discussions, let's say. How can you have a knowledge economy when there's a lot of caps on what you can discuss? So these are the problems that we're going to face moving forward.
We have time for one last question. You, sir.
Professor Asmani, LCU and UL. First, thank you very much for Mr. Peter and Madam Al-Anoud for the interesting information you gave us. I came late, so I couldn't attend Dr. Karen and Dr. Muhammad, but I'm sure they were also very interesting. I just have small questions about Kuwait and the area and the Gulf area. Can you please give us some figures, some information about the percentage of foreigners, foreign main-d'oeuvre working in these areas, in Kuwait and these areas? And second, do they have any rights, political or economics, please? Thank you.
Did you want to take it? And I don't mind.
Do you want to say a few words about foreign workers?
And what rights do they have?
No, Alan, go ahead. I mean, yes, across the GCC there are obviously lots of non-citizens who are working, and it's more pronounced in Qatar and the UAE are the most extreme cases. In Saudi Arabia, it's maybe more like 30%. In Kuwait, more in the 40s, maybe up to 50. In Oman, between 30 and 40% non-citizens. So it really varies. I mean, the place where we see more people in the private sector, actually Kuwait and Bahrain are doing a bit better. So there's diversity, but in terms of access to property rights, to own property as a foreigner, this is one of the saddest things of the GCC crisis, and that was a very successful mechanism of economic integration where GCC citizens were, a lot of Qataris owned property in the UAE or owned businesses in the UAE. That's no longer possible. So not even just non-citizens being from outside the region, but GCC citizens losing their rights, which had been accorded to them through the union. So that's an issue. In terms of foreigners, there are, in the UAE, if you're in a free zone, you can own property. Protection of investor rights varies considerably. It's quite poor in Qatar, in Saudi, in Kuwait. I'm not as familiar in terms of ownership in the stock exchange, what rights do foreign investors have. But these are issues that are pervasive across the GCC, and it goes back to this real weakness of a rule-based economy. And this is what, for any of these proposed changes and all the vision documents that the GCC states share, this is probably the #1 weakness.
Yeah, if I can add to that, so I think it's also a socioeconomic question. So if you are a foreign worker, but in a white-collar environment, you are less likely to be exploited than if you are a laborer working, on a mass project. So the exploitation framework, unfortunately, becomes more likely when you are at the bottom of the pyramid, whether you're in domestic service or you're, a laborer on a construction project. But there's an increasing awareness of these issues. There's an increasing commitment to changing that. And Saudi Arabia has just announced that it's opening up a mechanism for foreign workers to reside in Saudi Arabia and then become Saudi citizens. So I think also tackling the naturalization laws is going to be a big issue moving forward.
Just one thing. Go ahead. Also, just in addition to it, in the case of Qatar, as you know, Qatar has been highly criticized for human rights and especially workers' rights in the past 6-7 years. But there is also improvements, especially the salaries and the payment mechanisms for blue-collar workers, in the sense that now the sponsors, there's the kafala system. The sponsors have to pay through the banking system, actually, rather than in the past. It was mostly through cash and more informal. But now with the new regulations and the new labor law, they have to be paid through. They have to pay to their ATM card. So this is one of and of course there's a lot of focus on Qatar due to the World Cup and like a large number of workers working for the stadiums and also infrastructure. And the second, just very small point, this is more at state level, but also at the social level, especially after the blockade started. I can see that there is a lot of enthusiasm among the Qatari youth to be more cognizant and aware of the blue-collar workers. Like, for instance, one of the discriminatory practices is, like, especially in the downtown areas, especially over the weekends in the Cornish area, workers are not allowed to be there, so they cannot get in. So one of the new initiatives of Qatari youth has been to kind of, because they can't enter, they create some other zones of engagement and socialize, especially during the weekends. So students bring different services to these areas. Especially Qatari youth has been very active in actually engaging more with the workers. And one of the organizations called We Feel For You, actually every weekend on Friday and Saturdays, they provide different kinds of food and different items, and they're taking workers to cinemas and everything. So this is one of the organizations which never existed before, but it's very new. We Feel For You, and it's something that I think cultivates and shows us some hope for more hope for the future. Yeah.
Just finally, building on what Mohammed has just said, I just came back from 4 days in Doha. And it was fascinating to see that the discourse, at least, was very much, we're all in this together, citizens and residents, including expatriates, with the blockade impacts everybody. And as Mohammed said, the notion that everybody is more or less, well, they're kind of breaking down some of the barriers in interesting ways. There was even I think we're out of time. There's even a measure which is interesting being under consideration to actually extend some of the subsidized goods to expatriates now, which actually could make worse some of the problems of economic sustainability. But it's fascinating to see how this is beginning to shift under external pressure. Some of the internal dynamics are changing, perhaps. We are out of time. We're now going to break for lunch. It's on the 5th floor, right, Kadir? So on the 5th floor, and we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock. But I'd like to thank all the panelists and thank you also for attending.